After a year of war, at least 8,000 civilians are dead, entire cities are destroyed, and millions of Ukrainians have had to flee their homes. In moments, we'll talk to Canada's ambassador in Kyiv and Ukraine's ambassador here in Ottawa, who will join us together. Then, an exclusive one-on-one with a leader on Russia's doorstep.
Ukraine must win this war, and Putin must lose it.
Latvia's prime minister on negotiations among allies to send fighter jets to Ukraine and Putin's most recent nuclear threat. All of that is ahead, plus a special edition of The Front Bench with this country's top foreign policy experts who will reflect on 1 year of the largest armed conflict in Europe since the Second World War.
The consequences of Canadians not standing with Ukraine, of the world not standing with Ukraine right now, could be devastating and long-reaching for the entire planet.
The world readies to mark a somber milestone in Ukraine. Tomorrow marks 1 year since Russia invaded Ukraine, and the United Nations just wrapped up a special session voting on a motion calling for comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine. 141 countries voted for the motion. 7 countries, including Russia and Belarus, voted against it. 32 countries, including China, abstained. Prior to that vote, the Assembly debated the motion and what support for Ukraine should look like. Take a listen.
Ukrainians, Russians, and people far beyond need peace. Therefore, I encourage you to vote yes for the adoption of the resolution which Slovakia strongly supports.
The war in Ukraine sadly resembles the one in Croatia 3 decades ago.
It has been a year of immense suffering, death, and destruction. Today, we gather here to call for peace.
We all want peace in Ukraine, or at least the overwhelming majority of us want peace in Ukraine.
With me now, Canada's ambassador to Ukraine, Larissa Galadza, along with Ukraine's ambassador to Canada, Yulia Kovalev. Hello to both of you, ambassadors. Thank you very much for making the time today. Ambassador Kovalev, I'll start with you, and just wanted to get a sense from you of how significant the vote at the UN this afternoon is from your perspective.
Today, we have 141 countries who supported the resolution that actually support the peace formula of President Zelensky. And that is important for us that majority of the countries, the bigger majority of the countries, with the support of Ukraine, showed not only the solidarity, but also they supported this 10 points plan of President Zelensky that include both the full restoration of the territorial integrity of Ukraine, important thing about the nuclear security, food security, but also another important thing that is justice. Because for us, it's both important to end the war with keeping all of the Ukrainian territory within Ukraine and also to bring the justice after the war.
Ambassador Galadza, I've listened to a number of leaders reflect on the marking of the 1 year anniversary this week, starting off, of course, with Joe Biden, U.S. President Joe Biden in Ukraine over the weekend. And what I keep hearing over and over is the degree to which allies are unified in their support of Ukraine and their rebuke, really, of Russia. Does the vote at the UN today underscore that for you?
Absolutely, it does. And I think it comes in a week where the world needs to hear this message and Ukrainians need to hear this message. I consistently hear from Ukrainians that what allows them to keep going is the hope that they get because they haven't been left alone. The hope that they have because we are here with them physically in terms of the financial and humanitarian and military support that we have provided over the course of the last year, in the visits that we've had in the past week, including from Canada's foreign minister, and then today, this really important signal from the General Assembly.
Ambassador Kovalev, yes, it was 141 countries who voted in favor. There were also countries I think we would expect to vote alongside Russia, but then there are some who abstained, and significantly, countries like China, like India, who have tried to navigate this as a so-called, on the so-called side of neutrality. Does such a thing exist from where you sit?
we see some of the countries that still are in neutrality, and we are talking actively to many of them. We also see some countries who abstained last time and were in support of Ukraine this time. And that is part of our big diplomatic effort to knock to those countries and to explain that this is the black and white situation where abstaining is actually supporting the aggressor. And with getting more and more support and talking and also engaging with our partners, especially to the countries with the global south, as we are trying to explain them that the big issue of food security is something what Russia created and forced by invading Ukraine. And this is where these countries, and specifically the low-income countries in the African continent, suffer, and their people suffer. Although these countries are far away in terms of the distance from Ukraine, but the impact of the war, especially on the food security and the peak prices for food that we were witnessing last year, was the direct consequences of Russian invasion. And so it's for the benefit of these countries and for the benefit of people, global economic growth, this to stand with Ukraine and support us.
I think Ambassador Kovalev makes a good point, Ambassador Galadze, about some countries migrating positions. But when you think about countries like China and Iran, where there are very real concerns at this moment that they aren't really neutral, they may be abstaining, but they may also be considering or already supporting Russia in its efforts to wage war on Ukraine. How concerned from Canada's perspective are you about that and about what? I mean, President Putin announced a visit from President Xi Jinping to Russia in the future. How much does that worry you?
I think that we've always been worried about anything that could make this war go on longer. And so we watch these things closely, and the entire network of Canadian diplomats around the world is working to do, as Ambassador Kovalev said, to shift from support to abstention, support for Russia to through abstention to support for Ukraine, and so we're seeing that happen, and this is going to be this is long-term work.
When we talk about the form that support takes, Ambassador Kovalev, the last time I think you were sitting in that chair, we were discussing the possibility of tanks being supplied to Ukraine and the hesitancy of Germany at that point, and your belief that allies would eventually come together and supply those. That did come to fruition. Now the conversation has migrated to what President Zelensky has said is most needed for the next phase of this war, the counteroffensive in the spring, and that is fighter jets. I spoke to Poland's ambassador the other night who said, we're willing to supply them, but we are not, and sort of delineating from the tank situation, we are not willing to do it alone. Are you concerned about the prospect for allies getting on the same page with fighter jets, or do you anticipate it will turn out just like the tanks?
Vashi, through this year of war, we went through with a different kind of the weapons, from the messages of our partners that never, it's too complicated, Ukrainians have not been trained, they don't know how to use these weapons, to supplying these weapons. It was the same with NATO standard artillery, armed vehicles, that was the same with tanks. And now we understand that how to work, how to talk, and how to explain, because we very openly explain to our partners, especially from our defense side. Ministers are talking and diplomats are talking and explaining why we need this. And I'm very optimistic as well for the fighter jets. It just needs more time. The same story was with Leopard tanks. Germany was saying that they will supply them if any other country will supply them. Then the UK government made first decision to supply NATO standard tanks, and then US announced that they will supply tanks, and then Germany announced, and then Canada announced, and many other countries joined the tank coalition. So now our efforts is to persuade and just explain why we need them, because Russian missiles are still flying over Ukrainian territory and hit critical infrastructure. Mm-hmm. Our air is still not protected, and in order to be able to liberate the territories, to prepare and be able to move to counteroffensive operations, we need also the air shield.
Ambassador Galadze, you're in Kyiv. You would be acutely aware of exactly what Ambassador Kovalev just laid out. Do you understand the point that Ukraine is making that they need those fighter jets? Are you sympathetic to that point?
I'm very sympathetic to Ukrainians who say that if we give them the tools, they will finish the job. And the discussions started last year in a very, very different place, and we've seen the same story repeat itself throughout the year, where allies, Ukraine's closest partners, have done what was necessary, and that's where we are today. And the discussion on fighter jets is today's discussion.
If I could follow up with you, Ambassador Gladza, on that, and I don't pretend to say that Canada has an arsenal, we know very, very well, an arsenal of fighter jets to lend. But in other instances where we didn't have the equipment, for example, a missile defense system, Canada purchased one for Ukraine. Are there active conversations in the government of Canada about how it can be part of the conversation around supplying fighter jets to Ukraine?
Canada's a really active participant in the Ramstein group of I think over 40 countries now that regularly gets together with the Ukrainian defense minister and military leadership to understand what Ukraine needs. And then those 40 countries very much work together to optimize what they have and to answer Ukraine's requests.
Do you see, though, Canada playing a role specifically in the request around fighter jets?
Those requests all go back to Ottawa with Minister Anand, who participates in those discussions, and I know that she then has discussions in Ottawa. Absolutely.
Okay, Ambassador Kovalev, last word to you, and I'm just going to jump off of what Ambassador Gladza said there. Do you see Canada playing a role? I'm not going to pretend that we have a lot of fighter jets, but like I said, there have been other instances where Canada kind of got creative. Is the ask of Ukraine for Canada to be involved in that discussion, in the next phase of the war?
First of all, Vashi, you've said very rightly, Canada has been first very supportive, second very creative, and Canada joined all the so-called military equipment coalitions that Ukraine created and advocated for. What is in reality how this dialogue is built, that the countries to whom we are talking in Canada is active participants in those talks, try to find the place where a country can do the most effective things. Where when it comes to Canada, Canada has been supportive, especially on the armed vehicles, on the artillery, on the tanks. And so we're trying to find now this place, how to make it most efficient out of our discussion for the fighter jets. And this conversation is now going among many of the allies, because mostly we are talking about F-16 fighter jets. That is what Canada does not have. But the window for any creative decision, Ukraine, of course, will appreciate.
I'm sure. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much, Ambassadors Kovalev and Gladza. I really appreciate you making the time on such an important day. Thank you. Coming up, more on the next phase of Russia's war on Ukraine. After a quick break, our exclusive interview with Latvia's Prime Minister. We are back right after this. Russia's war on Ukraine was a major wake-up call for Europe and NATO in many different ways. Since the start of the war, for example, Germany reversed a decades-long defense policy allowing for weapons and tanks to be exported to conflict zones. Finland and Sweden moved from neutral to NATO, making bids to join the security alliance. And Canada boosted its deployment of troops to the continent through Operation Reassurance and Operation Unifier, the former based in Latvia. But for countries that border Russia, like Latvia, is that enough? I spoke with Latvian Prime Minister Krišjānis Kariņš. Have a listen to that conversation. Hi, Prime Minister. Pleasure to welcome you to our program. Thank you very much for making the time.
Pleasure to be with you.
When this war started a year ago, did you think it would still be going on, Prime Minister, a year later?
We had no idea. But what is clear is that 1 year ago, Putin showed the world his true intentions, which is imperialism, murder at its very worst way, fighting in Ukraine, fighting against civilians, civilian infrastructure, bringing chaos to a country, trying to obliterate it. What is the only good side of the story is that the entire West has pulled very firmly together in aiding Ukraine in fighting off this aggression. And I think that Canada's role has been very important, not only in strengthening the NATO presence here in Latvia, and very thankful that you're heading that NATO presence, but also your direct contributions to helping Ukraine. That's very, very much appreciated.
And I do, Prime Minister, have a couple of questions about that operation in your country in just a moment. But just to circle back to what you were saying about Vladimir Putin, he again made a speech today very specifically saying that Russia would, quote unquote, pay increased attention to boost its nuclear forces on land, sea, and in the air. How seriously do you take that threat?
Well, I think we have to take everything seriously. Russia is a serious threat to peace and security, not only in Ukraine and Europe, but around the world. He's been doing a lot of saber rattling this entire past year or so. Whether that means there's more to that, no one knows. But what is clear is that we have to take it at face value that Russia is not looking to be moving out of this war anytime soon, at least not of its own volition. And I think that's the message that Putin has given in his speech just the other day, is that he's not going to be stepping back. That means we have to be prepared for that.
You, given your geographic positioning as well as your experience, are more familiar than a number of Western allies with sort of the way in which Russia operates, the way in which Putin operates. Have you been surprised at all at the way that Putin has reacted to increased NATO strength, increased unity among those allies? Has anything that Putin has done taken you by surprise?
Unfortunately, no. What has come as a pleasant, maybe not a surprise, but a pleasant realization is how united all of us have become in the face of his aggression. But remember, this is a government, this is an individual who is basically a dictator in his country. It's all about maintaining power. And when things are not going so well at home, war on the outside to rally to the cause of nationalism is what they're resorting to. The propaganda going on within the country is that Russia is basically under attack and is fighting a war similar to that which was in the Second World War against fascism, and Ukraine and the West, including all of us in NATO, I suppose, represent this fascism, which is it's meaningless from our point of view, but very meaningful within Russia. And Putin, it seems that his grip on power, there's no signs that we see that it is weakening, which means that we have to take this threat credibly, and translate it as he's not going to be backing down anytime soon. But he does understand strength. He does understand force. This is the language that he understands, not one of diplomacy, but of force. And the strengthening of NATO's position in the eastern flank is a very clear signal to Putin. And of course, the support for Ukraine is an absolute necessity for all of us, because in Ukraine they are fighting and dying for the very values that we live by: freedom, democracy, and the rule of law, not the rule of thuggery.
I wanted to ask you about the nature of that support, because it certainly has evolved throughout the last year. In particular, we now note that Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky is very focused on procuring fighter jets, military jets of some sort, in order to counter what is expected to be an offensive from Russia this spring. I spoke to, for example, Poland's ambassador to Canada this week, who says Poland is willing to supply MiGs, but delineates between, for example, the supply of tanks in that they're not willing to go it alone. This has to be, from Poland's perspective, a concerted effort among allies. It can't just be one country going alone. Do you have an expectation that allies will evolve to that position, or does that seem a departure, too much of a departure from where they're willing to go?
I don't necessarily see that as a departure. Over the past year, I remember that on the evening of the February 24th, we were holding a European Council meeting when the attack started, and we were having debates who or whom we should or should not sanction as individuals, let alone debates on any kind of unity in sending weapons. 1 year later, everyone is sending weapons. There was talks of, can you send howitzers? Yes, you can send howitzers. Can you send tanks at first? No. Then now it's yes, it's tanks. So that is an evolving realization and position of the Western allies. I think it's important that Western allies move in lockstep. And sometimes it takes a little bit of time to everyone come to the same conclusion. But I think the conclusion is on one level very clear. Ukraine must win this war, and Putin must lose it. We cannot allow the rule-based system to simply be disentangled right in the heart of Europe, next door to all of the European Union. So it's the type of weapon I think is secondary to the fact that there's unity involved. And some decisions have taken time. From my country's point of view, well, we were providing weapons before the February 24th attack. We were providing the anti-aircraft weapons, the shoulder held, that were used to ward off the attack on Kiev in the first days. So we've been all in. We have given more than 1% of our GDP in terms of military aid, and we have a tremendous continuing groundswell of grassroots aid coming in all kinds of forms. So there's vehicles, there's buses, there's medical aid, et cetera, which is coming from civil society. So we're all in, and we're very happy to see that more and more of our NATO partners are also going all in. It's very important.
Speaking of being all in and NATO, I do want to, before I let you go, Prime Minister, ask you about the operation based in your country led by Canada. When you were visiting this country last year, the Prime Minister made a pledge to essentially double the contingent of the battle group that's there, the size of it, turn it into a brigade. I know that there have been discussions, I believe, that have started about how many soldiers each country ends up sending. Where are those discussions at, and when do you expect sort of all of this to be finalized?
First, I have to say I think Canada's leadership, Trudeau's leadership, is fantastic and very, very well appreciated in Latvia. Canada has stepped up. All the other NATO partners have stepped up. We are seeing more soldiers and, importantly, more equipment. That is, our capabilities are greatly enhanced. My own country, we're in the process of reintroducing conscription. We are greatly increasing our military budget. We are in the purchasing stage of getting our own anti-aircraft systems and some other new systems that currently our NATO allies are providing. So we're moving quite clearly in this direction. And the decisions, they're all coming together. And I have to say that under Canada's leadership, I have great confidence in all of our NATO allies, and especially in Canada's leadership, because what your country has done, that maybe not everyone in Canada understands, that you have forged a real fighting unit from 10 different NATO members. And this has actually not been done before. This is a true fighting unit which has been forged together. It took 5 years to get it fully operational, but Canada did that. Now we're just in the process of increasing its size and capabilities. So your country's leadership has done it once. I'm absolutely convinced that they'll be able to follow through on the next level.
There are a number of countries, including this one, Prime Minister, that are facing issues with the size of the military here, right? The pressures on the military, people retiring and not enough recruitment. Do you have any concerns that Canada will not be able to increase its share of soldiers as a part of this operation? Has that been conveyed to you at any point?
No, we don't have this concern, because remember, for a brigade to be operational, one thing is the number of soldiers, but as important, and almost from one aspect more importantly, are the capabilities that this brigade would have. So, if you have, 5,000 soldiers with only rifles, that's not going to be as effective of, say, half that many soldiers, but with a full range of systems that they can use. So moving towards the brigade, Canada is one of 10 NATO members in Latvia. If all members proportionally move up, as Canada already has, I think that won't be a problem. And so I don't see that as an issue at all. And within our own country, well, we're also realizing that we are at the upper limit of a volunteer army in terms of the numbers. we're actually above the proportion that some other countries have in terms of how many people volunteer. We're not having a problem with volunteers, but that kind of system won't give us the numbers that we need for our national defense forces. So we're reintroducing conscription, especially so that we have a much larger, well-trained and prepared and armed reserve force to be used at any time. So it's a process, and I think that Canada is doing a fantastic job.
Prime Minister, I'll leave it on that note. Thank you very much for sharing some of your time with us today. Latvian Prime Minister Krišjānis Kariņš there. You heard me ask the Prime Minister about Putin's latest nuclear threat. U.S. President Joe Biden was also asked about that renewed threat today. Here is what the president had to say in an interview with ABC News. Welcome back to Power Play. We have a lot more coverage coming up to mark Ukraine's, or rather the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But right now, I want to also tell you about what's happening in politics today. Here's the list.
We've actually just confirmed agreements in principle with the 4 Atlantic provinces and Ontario, who've said, yes, we're in for these healthcare deals. Let's start negotiating the details on how many family doctors we want to add, what we're going to be investing in mental health, how we're going to move forward to get the best possible outcomes for Canadians.
You heard it there from the Prime Minister. Ottawa has reached agreements in principle on healthcare funding with Ontario and the 4 Atlantic provinces. Canada's premiers have already collectively agreed to kind of an overarching deal that'll see federal health funding boosted by about $46 billion over 10 years. But the specifics won't be one size fits all. And now the federal government is holding negotiations with each province and territory for essentially bilateral deals. Google swinging hard against the federal government's proposed online news bill by blocking some 4% of Canadian users from viewing news content today. Part of a 5-week pilot project, the tech giant says. The legislation the feds are putting forward would require web giants, including Google and Meta, which owns Facebook, to compensate Canadian media companies for reposting their content. The government calls Google's move, quote, disappointing.
I've been in touch with CSIS. Initially, was approached by them because I guess they are concerned. CSIS never explained to me why they're interested to talk to me and also to solicit and collect information from me. But they did talk to me.